The house had been waiting for 9 years. Not in the dramatic sense that abandoned things wait in stories. Not with the specific Gothic quality of a place that has been sealed and forgotten. It waited in the specific, ordinary way of something that was stopped mid-sentence and has been holding the pause ever since. The walls were up. The roof was sound. The compound wall was intact and the gate rusted open at the angle of something that had given up on being closed. Inside, the building was raw concrete and exposed wiring and the particular quality of an interior that knows what it is supposed to become and has not been allowed to become it. Ada had driven past it every month for 4 years. Not to see it. She did not need to see it to know its condition. She had contractors assess it annually and the reports were always the same. Structurally sound, no deterioration beyond the cosmetic, the roof is holding, the foundation is excellent. She drove past it because driving past it was the specific, ongoing act of a person who is not ready to go in but is not ready to stop coming either. Today she had not driven past. She had parked outside. She had said to the man in the passenger seat, "I want to show you something." He had gotten out and looked at the gate and looked at the building beyond it with the specific, unhurried quality he brought to everything. Not the quick assessment of someone forming an opinion but the patient attention of someone who is actually looking, who understands that a thing reveals itself to the person who is willing to wait for the revealing. He said, "Whose is this?" She said, "Mine." He said, "What do you want to do with it?" She said, "I do not know yet. That is partly why I wanted to bring you here." He looked at the house for a long time. He said, "Tell me about it." She told him some of it. Not all of it. His name was Emeka Osei and he had been fixing cars on Balogun Street for 11 years. The workshop was his, not inherited, built. He had started with one hydraulic jack and a rented bay from a man named Baba Chukwu who had been on that street since before any of the current businesses arrived and who had assessed the 16-year-old Emeka with the specific, experienced eye of someone who has seen many young men arrive on a street with ambition and watched most of them leave with something less. He had given Emeka the bay on a month-to-month basis. He had never needed to ask for the rent early. 11 years later, the workshop had 8 bays and 4 mechanics and a reputation on that street and beyond it that had the specific, organic quality of a reputation that was not built by announcing itself but by being consistently accurate. People brought their cars to Emeka when other workshops had already tried. He had a specific gift. Not mystical, practical, the gift of listening. He listened to engines the way a doctor listens to a chest, with attention to what the sound was telling him rather than what he expected it to tell him. He had learned early that the problem is where it is, not where you expect it, and this single principle had produced more correct diagnoses than any amount of equipment. He had met Ada 6 months ago. She had brought a car with a specific intermittent noise that 2 other workshops had misdiagnosed. He had listened to it for 4 minutes. He had said, "Wheel bearing, front left." She had said, "The dealership said suspension." He had said, "The dealership was looking where they expected to look." He had fixed it in 2 hours. She had waited in the plastic chair outside the bay and he had noted, in the peripheral way he noted things that were not the engine in front of him, that she was the specific kind of person who waits without performing waiting, no phone, no fidgeting, simply present and quiet in the way of someone who has learned to use stillness rather than filling it. She had paid. She had said, "Thank you." He had said, "Bring it back in 3 months. The other side will go not long after." She had come back in 3 months. Then the month after. Then the month after that. He had not asked what she did. She had said, "Property." He had said, "Buying or selling?" She had said, "Both." He had nodded and gone back to the engine. This had produced the specific, unusual quality of a growing connection that had nothing to do with what either of them had or did. A quality he had not encountered before and had not known to look for. He had been falling in love with her for 6 months. He did not know she was the CEO of Cole Properties. He did not know she had brought him to this house to test him. He did not know any of this. He walked through the gate. She watched him from the gate. She had planned this, had brought him here with the specific, deliberate intention of seeing what he did with an unfinished thing that belonged to someone he loved, in a situation where he did not know he was being tested and therefore could not perform the correct response. She understood, from Kofi, that a test a person knows about is not a test. It is a performance. She had spent 3 years watching Kofi perform, watching him say the things she needed to hear, watching him be the person she needed him to be, watching the performance so well executed that it had taken 3 years and a journalist and a boardroom betrayal for the person behind it to become visible. She was not going to make that mistake again. Hence the house. Hence the Saturday morning. Hence the specific casual quality of I want to show you something, not I need to ask you something, not I need to understand something about you, simply, I want to show you something. An invitation with no pressure attached, which was the specific condition under which a person reveals themselves most accurately. She watched him walk through the house. He moved through it the way he moved through everything, with the patient, physical intelligence of someone whose understanding arrived through the body rather than the intellect. He ran his hand along a wall. He looked at the ceiling. He stood in the center of what would have been the main sitting room and turned slowly, taking in the full space. He went to a window opening, the frame was in place, the glass was not, and looked at the compound through it. He crouched at a corner of the room and looked at the floor junction. He was in the house for 40 minutes. She did not follow him. She stood at the gate and she waited. When he came back, he stood beside her and looked at the building from the outside. He said, "The foundation is excellent. Whoever built this knew what they were doing at the foundation level. The walls are solid. The roof is sound. I can see the quality of the timber from here." He said, "This building wants to be finished." She said, "What would you do with it?" He looked at it for a long time. He said, "That depends on what it means to you." He said, "A building is not just a structure. Something was intended here. Whoever started this had something specific in mind. Before I tell you what I would do with it, I need to know what they intended." He said, "Do you know what they intended?" She said, "Yes." He said, "Tell me." She said, "Not today." He looked at her for a moment. Not the look of someone who has been refused something, the look of someone who has received information about the shape of a thing and is filing it carefully. He said, "All right." He said, "When you are ready." He did not push. He did not press. He stood beside her at the gate and he looked at the house and he said, "It is a good house. Whatever it becomes, it is a good house. Someone loved this place. You can tell from the foundation." She looked at him. She thought, he knows. Not about the test. He does not know about the test. He knows about the house, can read it the way he reads engines, by what is underneath rather than the state of the surface. He knows the house was built with love and has been left with grief and is waiting for something. She thought, I have been standing at the gate of this house for 4 years doing exactly what this house is doing. She did not say this. She said, "Shall we go and eat?" He said, "Yes. Somewhere with proper jollof." She said, "I know a place." He said, "You always know a place." She said, "I pay attention." He said, "Yes." He said, "That is one of the things about you." She locked the gate. She did not tell him what had just happened between her and the truth she was not ready to say. She did not tell him that the 40 minutes he had spent walking through her father's unfinished house had been the most honest 40 minutes of the 6 months they had been building something together, because he had spent them being entirely himself without knowing she was watching to see who he was. She got in the car. She drove. 6 months earlier she had brought the car to Balogun Street for the first time on a Tuesday afternoon with the specific, low-grade frustration of someone who has been told the wrong thing by 2 people who should have known better. The frustration was not dramatic. It was the specific, contained quality of someone who manages large things and has therefore learned to manage small things with the same precision, to identify the problem accurately, to find the correct solution, and to implement it without wasting energy on the irritation that the problem exists. Linda had said, "There is a mechanic on Balogun Street who finds things other people cannot find." A woman in procurement had told her. The mechanic's name was Emeka. She had found the workshop. She had found Emeka. He had been under a car when she arrived, only his legs visible, the rest of him inside the vehicle in the specific, total way of someone who has gone where the problem is. She had waited. He had emerged after 7 minutes and wiped his hands on a cloth and looked at her with the direct, unhurried quality she would come to know as simply how he was. Not performing directness, not performing unhurriedness, simply the person. She had described the noise. He had said, "Drive it to the end of the street and come back." Slowly. She had driven it to the end of the street and come back. Slowly. He had stood outside and listened. Then he had said, "Will bearing, front left." Not gone yet, but going. She had said, The dealership said suspension. He had said, the dealership was looking where they expected to look. He said it without condescension, as a simple, accurate description of what had happened. She had said, how long will it take? He had said 2 hours. She had said, I will wait. She had sat in the plastic chair outside the bay and watched him work for 2 hours and had noted the following things. Not because she was assessing him but because she paid attention to things and he was the thing in front of her. That he worked without wasted movement, each action purposeful, each tool picked up and used and returned. That he explained what he was doing to the apprentice beside him in the specific, unhurried way of someone who understands that the point of explanation is the other person's understanding and not the explainer's performance of knowledge. That when the apprentice asked a question he stopped what he was doing and answered it fully before returning to the work. That he was precise about the torque settings and said, these are not suggestions, these are the numbers the engineer who designed this component arrived at through testing, and our opinion of them is not relevant. He had fixed the wheel bearing. She had paid. She had come back in 3 months. Then again. She had not planned to come back more than twice. The car had not required it. She had manufactured reasons, a service that was not due, a tire rotation she could have had done anywhere. She had not examined these manufacturing too closely because examining them would have required her to acknowledge what they were, which was that she was finding reasons to return to a workshop on Balogun Street because the mechanic who ran it was the most direct and honest person she had encountered in a professional context in longer than she could accurately calculate. She had not told Linda this. She had told Linda, the workshop is reliable. Linda had said, reliable enough to go back 4 times? She had said yes. Linda had looked at her with the specific, long-suffering quality of someone who has known a person for long enough to read what they are not saying. Linda had said, what does he look like? She had said, Linda. Linda had said, I am asking for professional reasons. She had said, Linda. Linda had said, all right. She had gone back to her screen. Then Ada. She had said, what? Linda had said, just tell me when you are ready to talk about it. She had said, I will. She had not yet. The company was called Cole Properties and her father had started it and she had finished it. Not in the simple sense of completing something her father had built. In the more complex sense of taking a foundation that was real but modest and building something on top of it that her father had not imagined and that she had imagined specifically because she had watched him build the modest version and understood exactly what had limited it and had decided that those limitations were not structural, they were choices, and she was going to make different choices. Her father had been an architect. A good one, not a famous one, a good one which is a different category and sometimes a better one. He had spent his career building other people's visions and had been precise and honest and had delivered what he promised, which in the construction industry was rarer than it should have been and had produced a reputation that was not large but was durable. He had started Cole Properties when she was 18, a small property development company, buying land and building modest residential units. It had been alive when he died, but it had not yet been significant. She had been 25 when he died. She had sat at his desk the week after the funeral and looked at what he had left her, and she had made a decision that she did not make dramatically or with the specific, performed quality of someone stepping into a destiny. She had made it the way she made all decisions, by looking at what was accurately true, by identifying what was missing, and by deciding what to do about it. What was accurately true? The company had assets, relationships, and a name that meant something to the people who knew it. What was missing? Scale, ambition, and the specific technical knowledge required to move from modest residential to commercial development. What to do about it? Acquire the knowledge, build the scale, protect the name. She had spent 2 years acquiring the knowledge. Not at school. She had not gone back to school. She had acquired it the way her father had acquired his craft, through the specific, irreplaceable education of doing things alongside people who had already done them. She had attached herself to a commercial developer, worked for 2 years at a salary that was an insult to what she was worth, learned everything available, and left. She had spent the next 7 years building. Cole Properties was now the company it was, significant, respected, with a portfolio that had her father's precision embedded in it because she had not forgotten what had made the modest version good even as she made the larger version. She had not forgotten because she could not afford to, because the thing that had limited her father's company was not his precision but his reach, and she had extended the reach while keeping the precision, and the combination had produced something that was harder to replicate than either quality alone. She had done this on her own, then Kofi, and then not on her own in the way she had hoped, which turned out to be the same as on her own but with the additional weight of having been wrong about someone she had trusted. And then Emeka. Kofi had arrived at a dinner party. Not the specific dinner party, there had been many dinner parties in those years, the specific, ongoing social calendar of someone building a company who understood that the relationships built at tables mattered as much as the relationships built in boardrooms. He had arrived at one of them with a mutual friend, and he had been across the table from her, and he had asked intelligent questions about commercial property development that were not the questions people usually asked, which were surface questions dressed as intelligent ones. His questions went somewhere. They demonstrated that he had been paying attention to the industry before he came to the dinner. She had been interested, not immediately romantically, professionally first, the specific quality of interest that arrives when someone demonstrates they understand what you are doing at the level it actually operates rather than the level it appears to operate. She had said, "What do you do?" He had said, "Investment advisory." He had said, "I have been watching coal properties for 2 years." She had said, "And?" He had said, "And I think you are undervaluing your commercial portfolio relative to the residential." He had said, "The residential is what built the name, but the commercial is what will build the scale, and you are not pricing it as though you believe that yet." She had looked at him. She had said, "Have dinner with me on Thursday." He had come to dinner on Thursday. Then the Thursday after. Then the Thursday after that. She had not been in love before in the specific sense that Kofi produced, had been in relationships, had been close to people, had cared about people. But the specific compound quality of loving someone who also understood what she was building, who sat across from her at dinner and talked about coal properties the way she talked about it, with the specific technical fluency of someone who had done the work of understanding it, was new. It produced the specific, dangerous quality of feeling known, of feeling that the person across from her was seeing the full thing rather than the visible parts of it. 3 years. He had been present for the years when coal properties crossed from significant to substantial. He had been in the room when she made the decisions that produced the crossing. He had been useful. She could not deny this even now, even with what she knew. His investment advisory background had produced specific, accurate insights about portfolio positioning that she had acted on and that had been correct. He had added value. This was part of what made the discovery so precise in its damage. Not that he had contributed nothing, but that he had contributed genuinely while also calculating, which was a more complex betrayal than simple parasitism. She had found out from Victor. Victor had been trying to profile her for a publication, had been circling for months with the specific patient quality of a journalist who believes a subject is worth the time. She had not agreed to the profile. She did not agree to profiles as a general policy. She had learned early that the story a journalist tells about a person is the journalist's story, not the person's, and the difference between those two stories is not always benign. Victor had called her on a Tuesday evening. He had said, "Ada, I need to tell you something." He had said, "I came across something at an industry dinner last week." He had said, "Someone approached 2 of your investors independently. Proposed a restructuring of coal properties that would have diluted your shareholding to a minority position." He had said, "The person claimed to have your confidence, claimed to have your authority." She had said, "Who?" Victor had said the name. She had been still for a long time. Then she had said, "Thank you for telling me." She had put the phone down. She had sat at her desk, the good desk in the good office that she had built from her father's modest foundation, and she had been very still and very accurate about what she was feeling, which was the specific quality of a person receiving the confirmation of something they had not known they were afraid of. She had not known she was afraid of this. She had not known she believed, at some level below the one she managed consciously, that the person who loved her might also be calculating what loving her was worth. Kofi arrived at the flat at 8 that evening. He had a key. He had had the key for 8 months. She said, "Sit down." He sat. She said, "I know about the investors." He said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "Ada, I was protecting the company." He said, "I have watched you make decisions that were right for the vision and wrong for the structure." He said, "The shareholding as it is currently held creates vulnerability." He said, "I was addressing the vulnerability." She said, "With my shares." He said, with a restructuring that would have brought in stable institutional capital and reduced your personal exposure. She said, and increased yours. He said nothing. She said, Kofi, I built this company. My father started it and I built it. She said, it is not a portfolio position. It is not an exposure profile. It is the thing I have been doing since I was 25 years old. She said, if you had questions about the structure, you should have asked me. She said, you did not ask me because you knew I would say no. He said, you would have said no. She said, yes, because it was my company to say no about. He said, I was trying to help. She said, you were trying to manage me. She said, there is a difference. He said, Ada, she said, take the key off the ring and leave it on the table. He looked at her. She said, Kofi, the key. He took the key off the ring. He put it on the table. He left. She had not cried. She had gone to the kitchen and made tea. She had sat at the kitchen table and drunk the tea, and outside the window the Lagos evening had proceeded with the specific, indifferent quality of a city that does not pause for the endings of things. She had finished the tea. She had washed the cup. She had gone to bed. She had not been in love since. Until Emeka. And Emeka arrived in the specific, direct way of someone who was not calculating anything, who had no idea what Cole Properties was worth and therefore no reason to calculate, and said, the dealership was looking where they expected to look, and recommended against his own income, and explained torque settings to an apprentice as though the apprentice's understanding mattered more than the efficiency of the explanation. She had thought, this might be real. She had also thought, I have thought that before. Hence the house. Linda called that evening while Ada was still at her desk reviewing a site assessment. She said, how did it go? She said, he walked through the house for 40 minutes. Then he came back and stood at the gate and said someone loved this place. Whatever it becomes, it is a good house. Linda was quiet for a moment. She said, Ada. She said, I know. She said, you have to tell him. She said, I know. She said, not about the test. He does not need to know about the test. About the company. About who you are. She said, I know, Linda. She said, when? She said, soon. She said, you said soon 3 months ago. She said, I know. She put the phone down. She sat in the office for a while after. The building was quiet, the specific Friday evening quality of a company office that has released its people for the weekend and is resting. She was often the last one here. This did not bother her. She had always been the last one in buildings that required the last person to be thorough. She thought about Emeka in the house. She thought about the specific quality of his attention, the way he moved through spaces as though space was a text he was reading, as though the walls and the floors and the junction of one surface with another were telling him something that required patience to hear. She thought about her father. Her father had taken her to see the plot when she was 12. They had driven to the quiet street in the late afternoon and stood at the edge of the empty land, and he had said, one day I am going to build something here that will last longer than me. She had said, what kind of something? He had said, a home. Not a house. A home. He had said, there is a difference. A house is a structure. A home is a structure that has been chosen. He had said, every room in a house has a purpose. In a home, every room has a meaning. He said, I want to build the kind of place where the table is always full and nobody has to leave early because they have somewhere better to be. She had been 12 and she had not fully understood the distinction, but she had understood that it mattered to him and that the matching was the important part. He had started building when she was 20. He had said, Ada, come and see. She had gone on a Saturday. The foundation was in. He had stood at the edge of it and said, this is the part most people do not appreciate. He had said, the foundation is invisible when the house is finished. Nobody looks at a house and says, what a magnificent foundation. But everything the house is the foundation. Everything that makes it stand is down here in the ground where nobody can see it. He had said, I always spend the most time on the foundation. He had died when she was 25. The house had been at roof level. She had finished the roof because an unroofed building deteriorates and she could not let the last thing he built deteriorate. But she had not gone further. Every decision about the interior required her to complete someone else's vision, and she had not been ready. Not the vision of an unknown client, the vision of her father, the man who had said a home is a place where nobody has to leave early because they have somewhere better to be, and who had not lived to build it. For years had passed. The house held its roof. The foundation held its walls. The interior held its breath. Emika had stood at the gate and said, "This building wants to be finished." The following week she went to the workshop on a Tuesday afternoon. Not for the car. The car was fine. She went because she had been thinking since Saturday about what he had said, and she wanted to see him with the specific, simple want of someone who has stopped pretending they are coming for the car. He was with a customer when she arrived, explaining something about a transmission with the patient, physical quality of demonstration rather than description. He was holding the part and showing the customer where the wear was visible. The customer was nodding but not fully understanding. He adjusted the angle of the part and said, "Look at this surface here. See how this edge is beveled when it should be straight? That is not a surface issue. That is what happens to the internal mechanism when the fluid levels have been wrong for an extended period." He said, "The fluid does not just lubricate. It cools. When the cooling is insufficient, the metal does what metal does under sustained heat." The customer said, "So it is my fault?" He said, "It is a maintenance issue." He said it without blame as an accurate description of a causal chain. The customer left. He looked at her. He said, "Car?" She said, "No." She said, "I wanted to see you." He was quiet for a moment. Not surprised, he absorbed things rather than reacting to them, which was one of the qualities she had been cataloging over 6 months without intending to. He said, "I have one more car this afternoon." He said, "Wait." She sat in the plastic chair. She waited. She watched him work and she thought about what Linda had said, "You have to tell him." She thought about what telling him meant. Not the logistics of it, the logistics were simple. She was the CEO of Cole Properties. Here is what the company is. Here is what it does. Here is why I did not tell you sooner. The logistics were easy. What was not easy was the specific interior question of what the telling would do to what they had. Because what they had existed in its current form in the specific space of his not knowing. In that space he had been entirely himself, had recommended against his own income, had explained things to the apprentice because the apprentice's understanding mattered, had stood in her father's unfinished house and said someone loved this place. He had done all of this without the weight of what Cole Properties was pressing on the interaction. Without the specific, distorting quality of knowing you are in the room with someone who runs a significant company and having that knowledge shape every word you say and every choice you make. She did not know what he would be like when he knew. She had known what Kofi was like when Kofi knew. She sat in the plastic chair and watched him work, and she did not tell herself she was being irrational. She was being rational in the specific, experienced way of someone who has been wrong before and has updated accordingly. She was collecting information. The house had been part of the collection. The 6 months had been part of the collection. She was not ready to stop collecting. He finished the car. He washed his hands. He came and sat in the second chair, the chair beside the plastic one that he put out when she came. She had noticed this. He put out the second chair specifically, and he said, "What did you want to see me about?" She said, "Nothing specific." She said, "I wanted to see you." He looked at her. He said, "Ada." He said it in the way he said her name, with the specific quality of someone who uses names carefully, who does not say a name unless the name is what is needed, and who when they say it means the full person. He said, "You came to a workshop on a Tuesday afternoon to see me." She said, "Yes." He said, "All right." He did not make it complicated. He said, "Are you hungry?" She said, "Yes." He said, "There is a place at the end of the street. Pepper soup. The woman who runs it has been making it the same way for 20 years and nobody has told her to change it." She said, "Let us go." They went. The pepper soup was excellent. She thought, this is the thing. This ordinary, specific quality of a man who knows a place where the pepper soup is made the same way for 20 years and nobody has told the woman to change it. This is the thing she had not had before. Not the pepper soup, the ease of it. The specific ease of being with someone who does not require a particular register from her, who does not need her to be the CEO of Cole Properties or the daughter of Chief Cole or the woman who had been wrong about Kofi. who needs her to be Ada and is comfortable with Ada being a person who comes to a workshop on a Tuesday afternoon because she wanted to see him and does not pretend it was about the car. She thought, I have to tell him. She also thought, not today. She ate her pepper soup. He told her about a car he had worked on that week. A vintage model, a collector's piece, brought in by a man who loved it more than he understood it, which was a specific combination Emeka had encountered many times and which required a particular quality of honesty that was also kindness. He had told the man, the car is beautiful. He had also told the man, the car has not been serviced correctly since you acquired it, and 2 of the systems are at the end of their service life and the cost of addressing them will be significant. The man had said, can you make it run properly? He had said, yes. The man had said, do it. He had said, I want to be clear about the cost first. The man had said, do it anyway. He had said, all right. She said, why did you insist on telling him the cost before agreeing? He said, because he should know what he is choosing. He said, it is his money. He said, I cannot make the decision for him, but I can make sure he is making it with the correct information. She said, most people in your position would take the job and give the cost when the work is done. He said, most people in my position need the work badly enough that they cannot afford to risk the customer walking away. He said, I have been here long enough that I can afford to be honest about the cost. He said, honesty is easier when you are not desperate. He said, which is why I think people should be set up in a way that removes the desperation, because when people are desperate they make the choices that desperate people make and then we are surprised by the choices. She looked at him. She thought, he is going to say something like this and I am going to have to explain why I did not tell him about the company sooner, and the explanation is going to be harder to give in the presence of someone who just said that honesty is easier when you are not desperate. She said, I think you are right. He said, are you all right? She said, yes. She said, I am thinking about something. He said, the house? She said, yes, partly. He said, when you are ready to tell me the full thing, tell me. She said, I will. He said, I know. He finished his pepper soup. She looked at him across the table, this man who fixed cars on Balogun Street and had 11 years of accumulated reputation built from showing up and being accurate and explaining things to apprentices because their understanding mattered, and she thought, I am going to have to tell him soon. She thought, every day I do not tell him is a day in which I am in the situation that Kofi was in with me, knowing something about the other person that they do not know I know. She thought, I told Kofi to take the key off the ring and leave it on the table. She thought, I am doing the thing I punished Kofi for doing. She thought, I have to tell him. She thought, not today. She paid for the pepper soup. They walked back to the workshop. He said, drive carefully. She said, I always do. He said, you drive like someone who is thinking about other things. She said, I am usually thinking about other things. He said, I know. He said, it is not a criticism. He said, just be careful. She got in the car. She drove. The months between the first visit and the house had their own specific texture. Not dramatic months, the specific, ordinary quality of a connection building in the way connections build when neither person is performing the building. They did not have a conversation about what they were doing. They did not arrive at a moment of declaration or the specific social formality of defining the thing. The thing defined itself through the accumulation of the specific, ordinary moments that constitute a real connection rather than the performed version of one. She came to the workshop. He was always there when she came, not because he arranged to be there, because 11 years of running his own workshop had produced the specific, occupational quality of someone whose presence in their own space is the default rather than the exception. He was there because the work was there and the work required him, and he had never seen a reason to be elsewhere when the work was present. She would arrive and he would say, car? And she would say, no, just passing. And he would say, sit. And she would sit in the plastic chair. And the afternoon would proceed around them, the workshop sounds, the apprentices, the specific, ongoing mechanical conversation of a space that was always in the middle of something, and they would talk. They talked about the cars mostly in the beginning. He told her things about engines that she had not known she was interested in knowing and found she was. Not the operational knowledge. She understood her car well enough to manage it. She had always understood the things she depended on. What he gave her was the deeper version, the engineer's version, the version that explained not just what was happening but why it was designed to happen that way and what the original thinking had been and where the design had succeeded and where it had produced the specific, foreseeable compromises of any design decision. He told her once about the evolution of the combustion engine over a century and why certain fundamental problems had never been solved and were unlikely to be solved because the solutions required trade-offs that the market had decided were not acceptable. She had said, "Why do you know all of this?" He had said, "Because I need to know what I am working with." He had said, "If I only know how the thing behaves, I can fix it when it fails in the ways I have seen it fail before. If I know why it was built the way it was built, I can fix it when it fails in ways I have not seen before." She had thought about this for several days after. She had thought about how this was also true of companies. He had left school at 16. He had told her this on an afternoon when she had asked, not intrusively, the specific, natural way a question emerges in the middle of a conversation about something else, as though the question has been waiting for a gap. He had said, "My mother became ill." He said it simply, without the specific, performed quality of a difficult thing being shared in a way that requires the other person to respond to the sharing rather than the content. He said, "She was sick for 4 years." He said, "The fees were not possible." He said, "I made the calculation that was available and left." She said, "What was the calculation?" He said, "My mother needed someone present. She needed things managed. She needed the specific, daily attention of someone who was not also in a school building for 6 hours." He said, "I was the oldest." He said, "The calculation was not complicated." He said, "It was just the available thing." She said, "Did you regret it?" He was quiet for a moment. He said, "I spent 3 years angry about it." He said, "Not at my mother." He said, "At the situation." He said, "The specific, useless anger of someone who knows the situation is not anyone's fault and is angry anyway because the anger needs somewhere to go." He said, "Then I stopped being angry." He said, "I am not sure exactly when." He said, "One day the anger was not there anymore and something else was there instead." She said, "What?" He said, "Work." He said, "I had been working the whole time, but for 3 years the work had been underneath the anger and I had not been fully present to it." He said, "When the anger left, the work was just the work and the work was something I was good at and the being good at it was enough." She said, "Is your mother well now?" He said, "She died in the 3rd year." He said, "The illness was the kind that does not leave room for getting well." He said, "She had 4 years and she used them correctly." He said, "She was not a person who wasted what was available." She said, "You are like that." He looked at her. She said, "You do not waste what is available." She said, "I have been watching you work for months." She said, "You do not take a job further than it needs to go. You do not oversell. You do not underdeliver." She said, "You are precise about what is actually required." He said, "My mother was a seamstress." He said, "She taught me." He said, "She used to say, 'The cloth tells you how much it needs.' She said, 'If you add more than the cloth needs, you have wasted the cloth and you have not improved the garment.'" He said, "I think about that when I am working on an engine." He said, "The engine tells you how much it needs. The job is to give it exactly that and nothing more and nothing less." She said, "That is also a philosophy for running a company." He said, "I imagine it is a philosophy for most things." He had built the workshop without a loan. This was the thing she found out 3 months in from Baba Chukwu, the old man who still occupied the provision shop at the end of the street and who had the specific, comprehensive knowledge of someone who had been watching the street since before its current inhabitants arrived. She had been buying water from his shop one afternoon and he had said, "You are the woman who comes to see Emeka." She had said, "I bring my car." He had smiled with the specific quality of someone who did not believe this but was not going to say so. He had said, "He built that workshop from nothing, you know." He said, "When he came here he had 1 jack and a rented bay." He said, "Every year something was added." He said, "Never borrowed." He said, "He used to say, 'I will expand at the speed the work supports.'" He said, "Not faster." He said, "The work will tell me when it is ready for the next thing." She had stood outside Baba Chukwu's shop holding the water and thought, He applies the same principle to his business that he applies to engines. He expands at the speed the work supports. He gives the thing exactly what it needs and nothing more. She had thought, this is a person who is consistent. She had thought, the consistency is the thing. Not the consistency of someone who is performing a character, the specific, reliable consistency of someone who has arrived at a way of being that works and has no reason to deviate from it because the way of being is not a strategy, it is simply who they are. She had found Kofi consistent too, for 3 years. She had told herself this was not the same thing. She had told herself, Kofi was consistent in the performance of a character. The performance was excellent. 3 years is a long performance. But a performance is always about the audience, what the audience needs to see, what the audience needs to believe. Kofi's consistency had been directed at her, had been shaped by what she needed, had been the specific, intelligent consistency of a person who had observed their audience carefully and was giving the audience what it wanted. Emeka's consistency had nothing to do with her. He had been consistent before she arrived. He would be consistent after she left. His consistency was the consistency of someone who had built a way of working and a way of being over 11 years that had nothing to do with impressing anyone because for most of those years there had been no one to impress. Just the work and the mother dying and the apprentices who needed to understand the torque settings because the engineer who designed the component had arrived at those numbers through testing. She had thought, this is what it looks like. Actual consistency. The thing underneath the performance. She had thought, I think I know the difference. She had also thought, I thought I knew the difference before. The question of telling him had been present since the 3rd visit. Not as an urgent question, in the beginning it had been a background question, the specific, low-level presence of something she knew she would have to address eventually and had decided to address when it became necessary. She had told herself, if this is nothing, there is nothing to tell. She had told herself, if this becomes something, I will tell him when it becomes something. It had become something by the 2nd month. She had known it had become something on a specific afternoon, a Wednesday, she remembered it as a Wednesday, when she had driven to the workshop with no reason more substantial than wanting to see him and had not manufactured a reason, had not invented a question about the car, had simply driven to Balogun Street and parked and walked into the workshop and said, I was passing. He had looked at her. He had said, you were not passing. He had said it without accusation, observationally, the specific quality of someone noting an inaccuracy. She had said, no. She had said, I wanted to see you. He had said, sit. The chair was already out. She had sat. She had thought, I should tell him. She had not told him. The reasons had accumulated over the months in the specific way that reasons accumulate when a person is not ready to act and needs the reasons to hold the space where action would be. Reason 1. She was still assessing. She needed more information. The information she had was good but not sufficient. Reason 2. Telling him would change the nature of what they had, and what they had in its current form was something she had not had before, a connection that existed in the space of her being simply Ada, not the CEO of Cole Properties, and she was not ready to give up that space. Reason 3. If she told him and it changed how he was with her, she would not know whether the change was because of who he actually was or because of what the information did to him, and she needed to know who he actually was. Reason 4. She was afraid. Reason 4 was the one she had not admitted to Linda. She had given Linda reasons 1 through 3 at various points when Linda had said, you have to tell him. She had not given Linda reason 4 because reason 4 required her to admit that the assessment she was conducting, the careful, deliberate, strategic assessment of a person she was supposed to love, was partly a mechanism for keeping the love at a manageable distance. If she never told him, then she never had to find out if knowing changed it. The assessment never had to end. The conclusion never had to arrive. Linda had said on an evening 4 months in when Ada had been at the office late and Linda had stayed with her because Linda often stayed when Ada was going to be there past 7. You know you cannot do this indefinitely. She had said, I know. Linda had said, at some point you have to just... She had made a gesture with her hands, the specific gesture of someone indicating the leap from one place to another. She had said, trust it. She had said, I am working on the trusting. Linda had said, Ada. She had said, I have watched you run this company for 9 years. She had said, I have watched you make decisions that other people could not make. She had said, You are the most strategically precise person I know. She had said, but you cannot strategize your way into loving someone. She had said, at some point the strategy has to stop and the thing has to just be what it is. She had said, and if it is wrong? Linda had said, then it is wrong and you are the person who dealt with Kofi and kept building and came out the other side. She had said, you survived the wrong before. She had said, the fear of being wrong is not a good enough reason to not find out if it is right. She had sat with this for a long time. She had said, give me a little more time. Linda had said, Ada. She had said, a little more. Linda had looked at her with the specific, long-suffering quality of someone who loves a person and disagrees with them and knows when continuing to disagree is not going to change anything. She had said, all right. She had gone back to her screen. 2 weeks later, Ada had driven to the abandoned house on a Saturday morning with Emeka in the passenger seat and said, I want to show you something. The night after the house, she had sat at her desk in the office for an hour after she had put the phone down on Linda. She had been thinking about what Emeka had said at the gate. Someone loved this place. Whatever it becomes, it is a good house. She had been thinking about her father. She had a specific memory of her father that she did not share with many people. Not because it was private in the protective sense, but because it was the kind of memory that required the right context to be understood, and the right context did not often present itself. It was a memory from when she was 7 years old. Her father had taken her to a site he was working on, a house he was designing for a client, the foundation being poured that week. He had held her hand and walked her around the edge of the foundation, and he had said, Ada, look at this. She had looked. She had seen concrete. He had said, this is what holds everything. He had said, the people who will live in this house will never think about this part. He had said, they will think about the rooms and the windows and whether the kitchen is big enough. He had said, but all of those things are possible because of this part that they will never see. She had said, so the most important part is invisible? He had said, yes. He had said, that is true of most things. She had been 7 and she had not fully understood him. She was 34 now and sitting in her office at night, and she understood him completely. She thought, the most important things are invisible. The foundation under the house. The torque settings that have to be correct because the engineer who designed the component arrived at those numbers through testing. The 11 years of showing up to a workshop on Balogun Street and expanding at the speed the work supports and never borrowing because the work will tell you when it is ready for the next thing. She thought, those are foundations. She thought, I have been looking at the visible parts. She turned off the desk lamp. She drove home. She sat at the kitchen table and she made a decision, not dramatically the way she made all decisions, by looking at what was accurately true and identifying what was missing and deciding what to do about it. What was accurately true? She had enough information. She had been collecting information for 6 months, and the information was consistent, and the consistency was the kind that did not depend on an audience. What was missing? Honesty. Her honesty. The specific, required honesty of a person who has been asking another person to be fully themselves while withholding her own full self. What to do about it? Tell him. Tell him soon. Tell him before the accumulation of the not telling became its own kind of betrayal. She went to bed. She did not sleep for a long time. She thought about the house waiting with its roof on and its foundation excellent and its rooms holding their breath. She thought, I know what that feels like. She thought, it is time to let someone through the gate. Victor's piece ran on a Wednesday morning. She had known it was coming. He had called the Tuesday evening before and told her it was running and told her what it contained and told her he had tried to pull it, which was true. She believed him. Victor was not a dishonest person. He was a journalist who worked for an editor who had made a decision, which was a different category of problem. Not a betrayal but a collision, the specific quality of two people with different interests occupying the same moment. The piece was not malicious. It was something more damaging than malicious, which was inaccurate in a way that was specific enough to sound plausible. It described her as a strategic relationship builder. It described the workshop visits as part of a pattern of cultivating contacts in business districts across Lagos. It quoted an unnamed source who described her approach as systematic. It did not name Emeka. It did not need to name him. Anyone who knew her movements would be able to connect the description to the workshop on Balogun Street. She called Linda at 7 in the morning. She said, "The piece is running." Linda said, "I saw it." She said, "He is going to find out." She said, "I know." She said, "Call him, Ada. Tell him before someone else does." She said, "I am going to." She put the phone down and she sat with the phone in her hand and she did not call. She sat with the specific, paralyzing quality of a person who knows exactly what they need to do and cannot make the body do it because the body understands what the doing will cost even when the mind has decided the cost is acceptable. She called at 9. He answered on the third ring. She said, "Emeka." She said, "I need to explain something." He said, "You are the CEO of Cole Properties." The way he said it, not a question, a statement, the specific quality of someone who has already received the information and is waiting for the conversation that the information makes necessary. She said, "Yes." He said, "How long?" She said, "Since I started the company. Since I was 25. He said, "I meant how long have you been coming to the workshop?" She said, 6 months. He said, "And for 6 months you have known exactly what I do and I have not known what you do." She said, "Yes." She said, "Emeka, I need to explain why." He said, "I am in the middle of something." He said it without coldness, simply accurately. He said, "Not today." He put the phone down. She sat at her desk with the phone in her hand. She did not call back. He worked through the day with the specific, concentrated quality of a man who has decided that the work is what is available and the work is what he is going to do. The engine in Bay 3 needed a full timing chain replacement. He did timing chain replacements methodically. It was not the kind of work that tolerated inattention because the tolerance for error was 0 and the consequences of error were not recoverable. He worked. The apprentice beside him handed tools and he corrected the technique twice and complimented the instinct once and the day moved through its hours. At 3 in the afternoon a customer he did not recognize came to the workshop. The customer was well-dressed. He looked around the workshop with the specific, assessing quality of someone who had not been to this kind of place before and was updating their understanding of it. He said, "Are you Emeka?" He looked up from the engine. He said, "Yes." The customer said, "I am a journalist." He said, "I am working on a piece about Ada Cole." He said, "I understand she is a regular customer here." He said, "I was hoping you might be willing to talk about your interactions with her." He looked at the journalist for a moment. He said, "No." The journalist said, "It would be a brief conversation." He said, "We are interested in the nature of the relationship." He said, "I said no." He said, "This is a workshop." He said, "If you have a car that needs attention, I can help you. Otherwise, I am working." The journalist looked at him. He said, "The piece in this morning's publication suggested her visits here were strategic. Do you have any comment on whether?" He said, "I asked you to leave." He said it in the specific, quiet quality of someone who does not need to raise their voice to communicate that the conversation is finished. The journalist left. He went back to the timing chain. He thought, briefly, about the irony of it, that the same journalist who had inadvertently forced this moment by running a piece that was inaccurate in its framing but accurate in its consequence was not a villain in this. Victor had told Ada about Kofi years ago. Victor's piece had now told Emeka about Ada. Both times the information had cost something. Both times the information had also been the thing that made the next thing possible. He thought about Ada. He thought about 6 months of her coming to the workshop and asking good questions about what was wrong with the car and laughing easily and sitting in the plastic chair and waiting with the unhurried quality of someone comfortable in their own stillness. He thought about the house, the 40 minutes he had walked through it and the quality of the space, the foundation that told him someone had cared, the walls that held the specific patience of something waiting. He thought about what it meant that she had known what he was for 6 months while he had not known what she was. He understood, in the way he understood most things, through the body, through the accumulated weight of what he had observed rather than through the intellect alone, that there was a reason. That a person who was the CEO of a significant property company and who had chosen to come to a workshop on Balogun Street and say, property buying and selling, and not say more, had a reason for the not saying more. The reason was not casual. It was not the reason of someone who had forgotten to mention something. It was a deliberate withholding of a specific piece of information for a specific purpose. He did not know yet what the purpose was. He thought, I will hear what she says when she explains. He thought, she will come. He was right. She came on the third day. She had decided to give him the 3 days. Not because she did not want to come sooner, but because she understood that arriving before he was ready to receive her would produce a conversation that was about her timeline rather than about what needed to be said. She had learned this not from Kofi, from before Kofi, from her father, who had said once, "The right time to say a thing is when the person you are saying it to is able to hear it." He had said, "If you say it before they are ready, what they receive is not the thing you said. They receive the intrusion of the saying." She had worked through the 3 days. The company moved regardless. The company had the specific, unpausing quality of a real enterprise that has achieved the scale where it no longer depends on any single person's moment-to-moment attention but still requires someone to be present and accountable. She was present and accountable, and she did the work, and underneath the work she was holding the specific weight of 3 days of not being able to do the thing she needed to do. On the third day at 5 in the afternoon she drove to Balogun Street. She did not go into the workshop. She parked across the street and she waited. He came out at 6:15, later than usual, the timing chain replacement having required the day it required. He saw her car first, recognized it at street distance, which was its own small thing that he knew her car at street distance. Then he saw her. He stood in the workshop doorway. He crossed the street. He said, "You are waiting outside." She said, "I did not want to come in without being asked." He said, "You have been coming in for 6 months." She said, "That was before I owed you an explanation." She said, "I did not think I had the right to walk into your space until you had heard what I needed to say." He looked at her. He said, "Walk with me." They walked along Balogun Street in the early evening, the street winding down from its commercial peak, the workshops closing, the traders packing, the specific, gradual quieting of a working street at the end of a working day. She told him everything. She told him about the company, not the public version, the full version. What it had been when her father died and what she had done to it and what it had cost. She told him about the 2 years working for the commercial developer at the insulting salary and what she had extracted from those 2 years that no salary could have compensated for. She told him about the decisions that had moved the company from significant to substantial and why those decisions had been right and what the risks had been and how she had managed them. She told him about Kofi. She told it fully, not the summary she had given herself in the years since, not the cleaned version of a story that has been retold enough times to lose its specific, jagged edges. She told him the way it had actually been. The 3 years of feeling known and finding out the knowing had been partly an instrument. The investors, Victor's call, the key on the table. She said, "After Kofi, I did not know how to trust the specific combination of someone knowing what the company was worth and also being someone I loved." She said, "Those 2 things had been the same person and the same person had been calculating while I was loving." She said, "I did not know how to tell the difference anymore between someone who was with me and someone who was with what I had built." He walked beside her. He said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "So you brought me to the house?" She said, "Yes." He said, "And watched what I did with it?" She said, "Yes." She said, "A building that is unfinished and waiting. I wanted to see what you did with that. Because that is what I have been since Kofi. Unfinished and waiting." She said, "I know that sounds." She stopped. She said, "I know it is not a fair thing to do to a person." He said, "No." He said it directly without softening it. He said, "It is not a fair thing." She said, "I know." He said, "But." She looked at him. He said, "I have been thinking about this for 3 days." He said, "I was angry on the first day." He said, "Not about the company." He said, "I was angry because you knew the full shape of me for 6 months and I did not know the full shape of you, and that is not an equal thing to do to someone." He said, "That is the specific thing that Kofi did to you." He said, "He knew what the company was worth before he let himself care about you as a person." He said, "You did a version of that to me." She said, "Yes." She said it with the specific, direct quality of someone receiving an accurate thing. He said, "On the second day I thought about what you had said at the house." She said, "What did I say?" He said, "You said you did not know yet what to do with it." He said, "That is true about more than the house, isn't it?" She said, "Yes." He said, "You have not known what to do with the whole thing. The house." yourself. Whether any of this, he stopped. He said, whether any of this is something you can trust. She said, yes. He said, I thought about the house on the third day. She said, what about it? He said, I thought about the foundation. He said, your father spent the most time on the foundation because everything the house is comes from what is underground and invisible. He said, I think you have been building on your father's foundation for 9 years and doing it well. He said, I think Kofi was a crack in a wall, damaging but not structural. He said, I think you have been treating it as a structural problem when it was a wall problem. He said, those are different things. A crack in a wall does not mean the foundation is compromised. It means the wall needs attention. She walked beside him. She said, Emeka. He said, yes. She said, how do you do that? He said, do what? She said, find the structural thing underneath the surface problem. He said, I listen to what the thing is telling me. He said, I do not look where I expect the problem to be. He said, I look where the problem is. She was quiet for a long time. He said, Ada. She said, yes. He said, I am still angry that you did not tell me. He said, I want you to know that. He said, I am not setting that aside. He said, but I also think you were not trying to use me. He said, I think you were trying to know if what is between us is real before the company was part of it. He said, I understand the reason even if the method was wrong. She said, it was wrong. He said, yes. She said, I am sorry. He said, I know. They had reached the end of the street. The evening was full now, the specific warm quality of a Lagos evening that has gathered itself into its own particular energy. Street food, generators, the ongoing life of a city that does not pause for anyone's significant conversations. He said, I have a question. She said, ask it. He said, the house. He said, the piece in the paper said your visits to the workshop were strategic. He said, were they? She looked at him. She said, the first visit was because my car had a noise 2 other workshops had not found. She said, the visits after that were because I wanted to come. She said, they were not strategic. She said, I am a person who is strategic about most things. These were not those things. He said, all right. She said, all right? He said, yes. He said, but I need one thing. She said, what? He said, the house. He said, tell me what your father intended. He said, the full thing. He said, not today. When you are ready. He said, I think the house has been waiting for someone to hear the full story, and I think you have been waiting to tell it to someone who will know what to do with it. She looked at him. She said, and you think that is you? He said, I think I know what to do with an unfinished building whose foundation is excellent. He said, I think that is a useful thing to know. She looked at the street. She said, yes. She said, I think it is. She told him on a Sunday, 3 weeks after the walk along Balogun Street. 3 weeks during which things had shifted, not dramatically, the specific incremental way that things shift between 2 people who have said the hard things and are now building on what the saying revealed. He came to the workshop. She came to the workshop. They had dinner twice. She told Linda. Linda said, finally. She said, Linda. She said, I am just saying. She told him at the house. They went back on a Sunday morning. She drove, he in the passenger seat, the car quiet between them in the specific, comfortable quality of a silence that does not need filling. She parked outside. She opened the gate. She walked through each room and she told him what her father had intended. The sitting room first. She said, he wanted it to face the compound so the light came in from the east in the morning. He said the morning light was the most honest light. It showed a room as it actually was rather than what you wanted it to be. She said he had a specific idea about the ceiling height. He said a low ceiling made people feel managed. He said a ceiling that gave people space to breathe made them generous with each other. She walked to the kitchen. She said, this was the room he talked about the most. He said, the kitchen is the real sitting room. He said people go to sitting rooms to perform being comfortable. They go to kitchens to actually be comfortable. He said he wanted a kitchen big enough that people could be in it at the same time without negotiating the space. that you could have 3 people cooking and 2 people sitting and nobody in anyone's way. She said, he used to say the table in a kitchen is the most honest table in a house because nobody sits there to impress anyone. She walked to the back of the house. She said, this was going to be the library. He said, your father wanted a library? She said, he always wanted one. His whole career he designed rooms for other people, and he said the room he most wanted for himself was a room where the books were on the walls so you could see what a person had been thinking about all their life. She said, he used to say that a person's library tells you more about them than anything else they own. She said, what they have kept and what they have not replaced and what is falling apart from being read too many times. Emeka was quiet for a long time in the library room. He stood in the center of it. Raw concrete floor, bare walls, the window opening looking out at the back of the compound where a tree had grown up against the wall in the 9 years since the building was stopped. A tree that had not been planted, that had arrived by itself and decided to stay. He said, Ada. She said, yes. He said, your father sounds like someone who understood what things were actually for. She said, yes. She said, he did. He said, the sitting room facing east for the morning light. The kitchen big enough that nobody negotiates the space. The library for the books on the walls. He said, this is a very specific vision. He said, this is a man who had been thinking about this house for a long time before he started building it. She said, he said he started thinking about it when I was born. He said he wanted to build something that would still be standing when I was old. He said, I want you to be able to bring your children here and show them the room where their grandmother kept her books. Emeka looked at the window opening and the tree beyond it. He said, the tree came after. She said, yes, after he died. It must have seeded from the compound wall. He said, he did not plant it. She said, no. He said, but it belongs here. She said, yes, I think so too. He turned and looked at the room. He looked at the bare walls that were waiting for the shelves. He looked at the window that was waiting for the glass. He looked at the floor that was waiting for whatever her father had intended to put on it. She did not know, he had not gotten to the floors before he died. He said, I want to finish this house. She said, I know. He said, I mean it as a practical statement. He said, I know structures. I know what makes a building hold and what makes it work and what the difference is between a building that functions and a building that people want to be in. He said, you know what your father intended. He said, between those two things we can finish what he started. She said, it will take time. He said, things that are worth doing take the time they take. She said, it will cost money. He said, I know. He said, that is a separate conversation. He said, I am not proposing the finance. I am proposing the knowledge. She looked at him. She said, Emeka, why do you want to do this? He said, because a good foundation deserves to be built on. He said it simply, without performance. He said, your father built the foundation. He said, the foundation has been waiting 9 years. He said, I do not like to see good work wasted. She was quiet for a long time. Outside the window, the tree moved slightly in the morning air. She thought about her father standing at the edge of the empty plot when she was 12 saying, a home is a place where nobody has to leave early because they have somewhere better to be. She thought about standing at the gate of this house for 4 years, driving past it every month and never going in. She thought about Emeka walking through it for 40 minutes on a Saturday morning and coming back to the gate and saying, someone loved this place. She said, yes. He said, yes? She said, yes. She said, let us finish it. He looked at the room. He said, we will start with the library. He said, I think the library is the right room to begin in. She said, why? He said, because your father wanted it most. He said, when someone wants something most, you start there. He said, the rest of the house will know what it is when the library knows what it is. She looked at the bare walls waiting for the books. She thought, he knows what to do with an unfinished thing. She thought, that is what I needed to know. There is something this story wants to say before it closes. She brought him to the house to test him. She did not tell him it was a test because she understood, from 3 years of a man who had been calculating while she was loving, that a test a person knows about is not a test. A test a person knows about is a performance. She needed to see who he was when he was not performing. And what he did in that house was the following. He listened to it. He moved through it with the specific patient attention he brought to engines, not looking where he expected to look but looking where the thing itself was telling him to look. He read the foundation and understood that someone had cared. He read the walls and understood that what was behind them was waiting rather than finished. He came back to the gate and he said, "This building wants to be finished." He said, "Someone loved this place." He did not know he was being tested. He also did not know, and this is what the story wants you to understand, that the answer he gave was not the answer to the test she thought she was running. She thought she was testing whether he was the kind of person who would respect an unfinished thing. He was. Test passed. But what she received was larger than what she tested for. She received a man who stood in her father's unfinished library and said, "When someone wants something most, you start there. The rest of the house will know what it is when the library knows what it is." She received a man who looked at a tree that had arrived by itself and grown against the compound wall and said, "He did not plant it, but it belongs here." She received a man who could read what things were actually for, not what they appeared to be, not what they were supposed to be, but what they actually were. A kitchen is the real sitting room. The morning light shows a room as it actually is. A good foundation deserves to be built on. The test was about the house. What she found out was about herself. She had been standing at the gate of her own life since Kofi, not going in, not finishing, holding the pause in the middle of the sentence. She had told herself she was being careful. She had told herself she was collecting information. She had told herself the test was a necessary thing. All of this was true, and the test was also unnecessary, because the man who fixed the wheel bearing at the correct torque settings, because the engineer who designed the component arrived at those numbers through testing and his opinion of them was not relevant. That man was already showing her who he was. Every visit, every conversation, every explanation to the apprentice because the apprentice's understanding mattered. Every recommendation against his own income because the customer deserved the correct information. She had the information she needed. She had been afraid to use it. The closing question: think about the person you have been testing. The one you have put through the careful, deliberate assessment of someone who has been hurt before and has decided they cannot afford to be wrong again. Think about what you have been waiting to see from them that they have probably already shown you. Think about whether the test is still necessary, or whether you already know, and the gate is the only thing still closed.